Good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends, dear ladies and gentlemen. Let me talk about carbon matrix and carbon budget. I see this as a way of a certain job sharing. And by the way, all the contributions you are able to see this evening are part of a special issue of Buildings and Cities. And Richard Lodge will come back to this at the end of our session. So my task is here to give you a very short overview about a possible job sharing between carbon matrix and carbon budgets. So from my point of view, it's very clear to all of us that the mitigation in the built environment is a large management task. And to do so, we must provide the main actors with appropriate basics and tools. Such basics and tools are indicators, the target itself, you can also call it a budget. We need calculation and assessment methods and rules, and for sure we need also some calculation tools. This creates together a package. If you have a certain budget, you need a very clear idea about the calculation rules and the method, and you can use also a very specific tool in relation to your budget, to your indicator, and to your assessment rules. But there is a second requirement. We must adapt such basics and tools to the object of assessment. And in the built environment, we have different types of objects of assessment, from national building stock down to a single building. And we must integrate this into the workflow and the options to act for the different stakeholders and actors. And Jamina explained to us already, there are planetary boundaries. There are science-based targets. There is a safe operating space. And this is our starting point. This is natural science. There is a certain capacity of our planetary ecosystem. And so we have something like a global budget. This is mentioned already several times in the IPCC reports. But how to go from there to our levels to act? In a certain way, we will share this between countries, between sectors, and first of all, we need a concept for fair share. So in a certain way, perhaps we will see something like adjusted budget per country, but now it becomes more interesting. We have different perspectives. First of all, and this is a typical macroeconomic perspective, there is a sector-related approach, typically taking into account just the direct emissions. But there are buildings, and buildings are not a sector, dear colleagues, not a sector. This is an area of action, an area of activity, dealing with the creation and the operation of buildings. And there is a third perspective, so-called area of need, and this is very close to your personal carbon budget or carbon footprint, and one of this is the service of housing. So right-hand side, just to entertain you, there is an old system to measure the amount of hard coal, and this will remind us we need appropriate tools to measure the carbon, but we must adapt this to our level of action and to our object of assessment. There are sector-based approaches per year, and you can see here the construction and real estate sector. And so perhaps this is the case in Germany. We will have around about 10% of national greenhouse gas emissions to produce construction products and 30% more to run all the buildings. Okay, we can subdivide the sector or transform the sector into the national building stock. Here we will have any kind of a life cycle stage in place, because in your building stock, in our building stock, we have in 1 year new construction, running the existing buildings, and also pull down existing buildings in the final life cycle stage. From there, we can go to a life cycle of a single building as object of assessment. We can have the embodied part and the operational part. But from the point of view of an user or an household, there is an area of need, among others, like mobility and food. So we will spend some greenhouse gas emissions, or at first some energy, and later we will create some emissions in the area of need housing. So it's linked together in a certain way, and you are able to see and to understand we have to transform specific information to different areas of interest to adapt this to different objects of assessment. So here our job sharing comes in. We have at first to take into account our object of assessment, our object of consideration. There are different tasks at different level. So we have sometimes the national building stock or the institutional building stock of housing or real estate companies. We can take into account the greenhouse gas emissions caused by a region or city or small urban unit, neighborhood, or a single building. And you have learned this 10 seconds ago. We can also take into account an area of action or an area of need. So left-hand side, you can see if we create a carbon budget, we follow typically a top-down approach. This is in relation to a specific target setting process based on sharing principles. And during the management process, we must undertake a budget compliance check. Right-hand side, you can see we need to define the system boundaries. We will have calculation rules and assessment methods, and we will deal with the carbon performance assessment. But because we have to adapt this to the very specific objects of assessment, we must be very precise to make sure that our actor, our reference unit, our time frame fits to the application case. So there are very specific budgets, but also calculation rules called metrics for the different objects of assessment. And we have to speed up. Jamina mentioned this already. Because, you know, our buildings are long-lasting goods. If we create or refurbish next year a building, it will be also in 2040, 2050 still part of the building stock. So we have to hurry up in a certain way. We must be sure from next year or at least in the next 5 years that each new or larger refurbished building will fulfill the requirements for buildings in the year 2050 or 2040. So we have to speed up to create legal binding requirements to limit greenhouse gas emissions in the full life cycle of single buildings. And here are already my final recommendations for the next steps. There are some challenges for the research community. Define science-based targets, solve remaining methodological questions, and our next presentation will deal with such a question here. We have to provide robust metrics, assessment methods, and tools, and we invite all of our colleagues engage with the political process. And there are, in addition, some challenges for the politicians. Please develop carbon budgets following a top-down approach.
Excuse me, Thomas, you have 2 minutes left.
Yes. We can invite the politicians to use a cross-sectoral approach in the national statistics to have this in a very specific way fit for the area of action. Again, there is a large misunderstanding. A poor sectoral approach is not enough to understand the full impact caused by the life cycle of buildings and to see any kind of possibility to contribute to the mitigation process. Next step, we must hurry up to create legal binding requirements, and we should make data and assessment methods public available to support the practitioners with useful basics and tools. And finally, we have to invite our national politicians to overtake leadership and to integrate all this in the green public procurement. So climate neutral now, and to do so, we must have a climate strategy, including climate budgets and climate metrics. Thank you.